Welcome to Cultural Lens, the podcast where we take a closer look at cultures around the world and challenge common misconceptions. I'm your host, Sophia, and today we're diving into some of the biggest misunderstandings about Vietnam. From food to traditions, there are so many myths out there. To help us set the record straight, I'm joined by a special guest.
Hi everyone, my name is Sol and I'm originally from Vietnam. As someone who has lived both in Vietnam and abroad, I've encountered plenty of misconceptions about my country. I'm excited to clear some of them up today.
Thanks for being here, Sol. Through this discussion, we hope to give you, our listeners, a clearer and more accurate understanding of Vietnamese culture. Let's get started. One common idea I've heard is that Vietnamese people all wear conical hats and ride bicycles everywhere. Is that actually true?
That's a great example of a stereotype. While the non la conical hat is a cultural symbol and still worn by some farmers or vendors in rural areas, most people in cities wear modern clothing. And instead of bicycles, motorbikes dominate Vietnamese streets. There are around 50 million registered motorbikes in Vietnam. Cities like Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi are incredibly fast-paced, with people driving scooters, using ride-hailing apps, and even owning cars.
That makes sense. Another thing I hear often is that Vietnamese food is just pho and spring rolls. What's your take on that?
Pho and spring rolls are internationally recognized, but Vietnamese cuisine is incredibly diverse. There are regional specialties like bun gel, savory pancakes in the south, bung bo hui spicy beef noodle soup in central Vietnam, and cha ca turmeric fish with dill in the north. Street food culture is also a huge part of daily life, offering everything from banh mi Vietnamese sandwiches to hủ tiếu noodle soups that aren't pho. Vietnamese food is all about balanced fresh herbs, vibrant flavors, and a mix of textures.
We also asked our listeners what misconceptions they've heard about Vietnam. One question that came up was, why do some people still think Vietnam is a war-torn country or underdeveloped?
That's a really outdated view, but unfortunately, it still exists. The Vietnam War ended nearly 50 years ago, yet many foreign media portray Vietnam as if it's still stuck in that era. The truth is, Vietnam has rapidly modernized. Cities like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi are bustling economic hubs filled with skyscrapers, tech startups, and major global brands. Vietnam is now a key player in industries like electronics, textiles, and renewable energy. The country also has a booming tourism industry, welcoming millions of visitors every year.
That's so interesting. So why do you think this misconception still lingers?
A lot of it has to do with outdated portrayals in Western media and education. When people hear Vietnam, they often associate it with war because that's what they were taught in school or saw in old movies. But Vietnam today is completely different. It's young, dynamic, and future-oriented. If people took the time to visit or engage with modern Vietnamese culture, they'd see a very different picture.
That's a great point. Another listener question we got was, is it true that all Vietnamese people practice Buddhism?
Good question. While Buddhism is the most practiced religion in Vietnam, the country is actually religiously diverse. There are also significant communities of Catholics, Cao Dai followers, Protestants, and people who practice traditional ancestor worship. Many Vietnamese people are culturally Buddhist but may not practice regularly. So assuming everyone is Buddhist oversimplifies a much more complex reality.
This has been so informative. Before we wrap up, what advice do you have for listeners who want to avoid spreading these misconceptions?
First, engage directly with Vietnamese people, whether through travel, social media, or cultural events in your area. Hearing first-hand perspectives is the best way to learn. Second, look beyond mainstream portrayals, read books by Vietnamese authors, watch Vietnamese films, or try learning a few words of the language. Lastly, be open-minded. Stereotypes exist because they simplify complex cultures, but every country is diverse and evolving.
That's great advice. Learning from direct sources makes a huge difference. Today, we tackled some of the biggest misconceptions about Vietnam and learned how to approach cultural understanding with more accuracy and respect.
Thanks for having me, Sophia. I hope this conversation helps people see Vietnam in a new light.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, we encourage you to reflect on your own perceptions and keep asking questions. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Next time on Cultural Lens, we'll explore the cultural nuances of Japan, so be sure to tune in. Thanks for listening.